So this Lent, we are journeying together in the way of Jesus, and today we will pay special attention to what it means to live holy. What does it look like to offer our whole selves to God?
Nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God. Nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God.
I will invite you to be seated this morning as we listen to the story together.
The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 12th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. May we be equipped by these words to walk in love for God, ourselves, our neighbors, all people, and all God's creation. One of the legal experts heard their dispute and saw how well Jesus answered them. He came over and asked him which commandment is the most important of all. Jesus replied, "The most important one is, Israel, listen. Our God is the one Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you will love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these." The legal expert said to him, "Well said, teacher. You have truthfully said that God is one and there is no other beside him. And to love God with all of the heart, a full understanding, and all of one's strength, and to love one neighbor as oneself is much more important than all kinds of entirely burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he had answered with wisdom, he said to him, "You aren't far from God's kingdom." After that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. While Jesus was teaching in the temple, he said, "Why do the legal experts say that the Christ is David's son? David himself, inspired by the Holy Ghost, said, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right side until I turn your enemies into your footstool.' David himself calls him Lord, so how can he be David's son?" The large crowd listened to him with delight. As he was teaching, he said, "Watch out for the legal experts. They like to walk around in long robes. They want to be greeted with honor in the markets. They long for places of honor in the synagogues and at banquets. They are the ones who cheat widows out of their homes, and to show off, they say long prayers. They will be judged most harshly." Jesus sat across from the collection box for the temple treasury and observed how the crowd gave their money. Many rich people were throwing lots of money. One poor widow came forward and put 2 small copper coins worth a penny. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I assure you that this poor widow has put in more than everyone who's been putting money into the treasury. All of them are giving out of their spare change, but she, from her hopeless poverty, has given everything she had, even what she needed to live on." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So this week, we find Jesus again in the temple, well, rather still in the temple, because we're just hearing the second part of the continuation from last week, and he's still there teaching and engaging with various groups of people in these days leading up to his death. And again, today we hear about more of these interactions that involve the legal experts, or in some translations, they're referred to as the scribes. Last week we heard about some of the run-ins Jesus had with them already. And just a word about who these folks were. The legal experts, the scribes, they were advisors and high officials to the priests in the temple. They are well educated. They know a lot about the Hebrew scriptures. They have spent time studying them. They know them well. They would have been part of the upper classes and recognized as authoritative teachers of Jewish law and customs. They would have been respected by their fellow citizens in that role. So these were the folks who were among others, right? There were more groups, but they were opposed to Jesus. So they already have openly challenged his authority to teach in the temple. And all of that background makes it all the more curious that we have this legal expert now who comes on his own to engage Jesus in another conversation. And it doesn't seem that he's doing this in any way that is adversarial. He seems, we're told, he's impressed with how Jesus has already answered these questions, how Jesus has dealt with the challenges and the traps that were put before him. We certainly can't know his motivations, right? We don't know what was in his heart and his mind when he came to Jesus with his big question. We can't know that, right? He asks, what commandment do you think is the most important? Which commandment is the greatest? We don't know his motivations for asking that question, but I think we can glean something from how he responds to Jesus' answer, right? Jesus says that the greatest commandment, well, there's two, they're kind of close together and related, right? To love God and to love one's neighbor with all yourself. The legal expert, he parrots back slightly different, if you notice. It's not the exact same, but very similar answers, right? They have this place of coming together here, and there is this moment of grace between Jesus and this legal expert, who we would have assumed would be Jesus' opponent or enemy, right? In that moment where they have this shared understanding, Jesus says to him that he is not far from God's kingdom. It's this beautiful moment of two people from opposing camps, right, coming close enough to find some common ground with one another. And I think that is worth noticing. We don't want to skip over that. It's really beautiful. And unfortunately, it's easy to miss because of all the other things that happen, not only in the text that we heard today, but what we've heard in previous weeks too. That this moment of coming together seems to be the exception rather than the rule with how Jesus interacts with some of these groups, like the legal experts. Because we see after this interaction, right, Jesus carries on teaching in the temple, and one of the very next things he does is issue this warning to those who are there that they need to watch out for those legal experts. Right? Many might consider them to be the most faithful people in society, but Jesus, he points out that they like to seek honor for themselves while neglecting the needs of the most vulnerable in their community. So Jesus might have had this shared moment with one legal expert, but overall, he's still not a fan. And against these legal experts, right, these ones that he points to as an example of what not to aspire to, against that criticism, Jesus points to this widow, this woman who's putting 2 small coins in the collection box at the temple. 2 small coins that would have been worth hardly anything at all. Like one of those coins apparently was worth like 1/128th of a daily wage. So we're talking like not even pennies, barely. She's put 2 of these coins in, but it was everything that she had. And for Jesus, this is what faithful living looks like. For Jesus, this is what it looks like to put into practice that love for God, and to do that with all your heart and being and mind and strength. In this moment, Jesus doesn't come out and say this directly, but again, Jesus is teaching what it means to be a disciple, what it looks like to follow in his way. To be a disciple, it means striving to give everything we have to God. The word everything that's used in this passage, it comes from the Greek word holos. And that's also the same word where we get the word holistic from, right? And that's kind of where our theme for today, living holy, comes from, that sense of wholeness, of entirety. And I point this out, I think it's worth noticing because it helps us to see or to realize that Jesus, when he's giving this, lifting up this widow as an example, it's not just about the money that she's giving. Her example and what Jesus is lifting up for us is that she is giving from her whole self, her whole life. It's another way for Jesus to teach us that discipleship is about this whole life kind of living, that it really is asking us to give our whole self to God. I think another piece of this is that it's also about having integrity in all areas of our life, or rather living fully integrated lives. And I think that's partly why Jesus has this issue and these harsh words for the legal experts, right? Because what he's pointing out about them is that they aren't living this way of integration, right? They act one way in public and then another way in private, right? They're out there seeking honor and respect from their community, and yet they dishonor and disrespect the most vulnerable in their community by how they treat the vulnerable. So there is this sense of them living these two paths or two lives. It's not integrated, not authentic. And that's not the way of living that we are called into, right? God calls us to this whole life living, not to hold back any area of our life, not to hold back any of the gifts or talents or resources that we've been given. That there ought not to be any part of our life or of our whole being that isn't offered to God, because we are in our wholeness, in our whole being. We are God's good creation. We are loved by God. We might not always live into that as God intends, but at our essence, our wholeness is loved by God. And to love God with that whole part of ourselves, with our whole being, that is, Jesus lists those things for us, right? To love God with all our heart, all our being, all our mind, and all our strength. To give our whole lives, everything that we have in service to God. And the interesting connection with that is that when we do that, when we give our whole self to God, it also is always in service to our community, to our neighbors, right? For when we love God, well, that will be evident. It will show up in how we treat one another. And when we care for our neighbors, when we love our neighbors, it's an expression of our love for God. And Jesus calls us to this whole life way of living for good reason, right? Jesus knows that when we can live this way, well, the world will be a kinder and more hopeful place. Jesus calls us to this way of whole life living so that the most vulnerable in our world are looked after. And Jesus also calls us to this way of living so that we too might experience what it means to be and what it feels like to be vulnerable too, because we try so hard, right, to protect ourselves, to insulate ourselves, to secure ourselves against that need to be vulnerable. But that is what this life of discipleship is too, to be vulnerable and to know that when we give ourselves away, when we give of ourselves in the way that this widow leads by example, to know that God will continue to provide for us. Now, I don't know how that sits with you this morning. For me, it's a reminder again that following in Jesus' way, that this call to discipleship is not an easy path, right? It's not a lot of attraction in some ways in terms of what the world might offer in terms of ease and comfort. Jesus' path is not an easy path, and that's something that the closer we get to Holy Week is going to become more and more clear. True discipleship always pushes us outside and beyond our comfort zones. And that is necessary It doesn't feel good, but it's necessary because that is how we grow more deeply in faith. That is how we learn to rely on God and rely on one another. It's how we live into that great commandment to love God and love our neighbor. So my prayer for us today is that the Spirit will give us the courage to live our lives wholly for God, and that for us as a community, the Spirit will put before us opportunities that invite us to do just that. Amen. Our hymn of the day is number 725, When the Poor Ones. And I will invite you to stand as you are able as we sing together.